I brought you all here because I'd like to inform you all that there's been an arrest of a suspect in the August 4th, 1981 murder of Miss Sylvia Quayle.
For 41 years, the family of Sylvia Quayle finally have justice for her death.
She had coffee with her parents every single morning. Not once in a while. Not on Sundays. Every morning. Rain or shine, tired or not, she walked the short distance between her house and theirs, sat down at their table, and started her day the way she'd started it for years. But on the morning of August 4th, 1981, that coffee never got poured. Because when her father walked those same 150 feet he'd walked 1,000 times before, he wasn't greeted by his daughter's smile. He was greeted by her body. And in that single moment, in the space of one horrifying discovery, an ordinary Tuesday morning in a quiet Colorado suburb became the beginning of one of the most heartbreaking unsolved murders in the state's history. This is the story of Sylvia Quayle. And I promise you, by the end of this, you're going to feel exactly what her family felt, the unbearable weight of waiting, and the strange, complicated relief of finally knowing. A story that took almost 40 years to find its ending. A story involving a serial killer's false confession, a science that didn't even exist yet, a secretly discarded soda can, and a family who never stopped waiting for justice. Stay with me. Because what happened to Sylvia, and what it took to finally catch the man responsible, is one of those cases that reminds you just how long darkness can hide in plain sight. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, this channel tells real cold case stories just like this one. These cases are researched thoroughly, so you're getting the truth and nothing but the truth. Hit subscribe now and let's go back to the beginning. Cherry Hills Village, Colorado. If you've never heard of it, that's kind of the point. It's the type of quiet, affluent suburb people move to specifically because nothing happens there. Wide lawns. Big trees. Neighbors who wave. 7 miles south of downtown Denver, but a world away from any of that city's chaos. This was Sylvia Quayle's world. She was 34 years old. And by every account, from her sister, from old friends, from the people who knew her best, she was the kind of person who made rooms feel warmer just by walking into them, and little did she know that she was about to stay 34 forever. She worked as a secretary at an architectural firm. But that job? That was just how she paid the bills. Her real passions lived outside the office. She was an artist. She made pottery, the kind of handmade pieces that still sit in her sister's home today, more than 3 decades later. Not because they are valuable, because they are her. She had also just started her own business, designing custom wedding cakes. Something she built from nothing, fueled purely by talent and love for the craft. And she was a history lover, too. Fascinated by the past. She spent hours researching the architectural work of her own uncle, tracing the buildings he designed, piecing together a legacy that ran in her blood. She was, by every description, ambitious, vibrant. The type of friend who, and this is something her family specifically remembered, would give away her very last dollar if you needed it more than she did. But here's the detail that breaks your heart the most. Sylvia wasn't just close to her parents. She lived beside them. Her house sat about 150 feet from theirs, close enough to walk over every single morning for coffee. Close enough that when something felt wrong, her father would know almost instantly. And on the night of August 3, 1981, everything still felt normal. Around 11 p.m., Sylvia picked up the phone and called her sister. They talked. Just a regular late-night sister conversation, the kind you don't remember the details of until years later, when it becomes the last conversation you'll ever have with someone. Nobody knew that just yet. Of course nobody could know. Because after that phone call ended, somewhere between 11 p.m. and the following morning, someone entered Sylvia Quayle's home. And he didn't come through the front door. Investigators would later discover that this person tried multiple points of entry before finding a way in. A small hole was found in a bedroom window screen, a failed first attempt. Then, in the bathroom, another screen had been removed entirely and thrown more than 50 feet away into a patch of tall weeds. Pry marks were later discovered along the wooden window frame. This wasn't a crime of impulse. This was patience. This was calculation. This was deliberate. Someone studied that house. Someone knew where the vulnerabilities were. And someone waited for the right moment to exploit them. Outside, on the phone line running to the home, investigators later found something almost chilling in its cleverness. A garden hose had been thrown over the exterior telephone wire and yanked down, tearing the connection to the outside world. It landed, of all places, across the hood of Sylvia's own car, a brown 1974 Corvette. Sylvia Quayle had been cut off. Silently, deliberately, and whoever did this wasn't finished. The following morning, William Quayle, Sylvia's father, walked the same short path he always walked. Same 150 feet. Same routine. Expecting his daughter, expecting coffee, expecting normal. Instead, he found her lying motionless on the living room floor. And in that instant, an ordinary father's morning became something no parent should ever have to live through. He called 911. Officers arrived just before 8 a.m. But here's what almost nobody talks about, the detail that, once you hear it, you can't unhear. When police arrived, William Quayle had already done something no father should ever have to do. In his grief, in his shock, he had taken a blooded white towel, one the killer had thrown over his daughter's face, and used it to cover her exposed body. An act of protection. An act of love. Too late to save her, but not too late to shield what little dignity remained. That single image, a devastated father, trying in his final moments with his daughter to give her back some peace, is the emotional center of everything that follows in this case. Because what the investigation would soon reveal wasn't just a murder. It was a fight and survival of the fittest. Sylvia hadn't gone down quietly, not without a fight. Her hands were blood-stained, her fingernails broken and damaged, clear signs that she had fought back with everything she had. Red marks along her neck and throat told investigators she had been strangled. And the physical evidence made clear she had also been shot and stabbed multiple times. She fought for her life in that house. Alone. In the dark. Against someone who had planned this and probably had the strength advantage. And for nearly 40 years, the person responsible walked free. But this is where everything started to change. In the days and weeks following Sylvia's death, investigators worked to build a suspect list, the way any homicide investigation would. And like so many cases involving a young, single woman living alone, the first place they looked was close to home. Sylvia's ex-boyfriend, a man investigators referred to as Pete, came under scrutiny early on. It's a common, almost predictable pattern in cases like this. Statistically, people are more likely to be harmed by someone they know than by a complete stranger, so investigators had every reason to look closely at the people in Sylvia's life first. But as detectives dug into Pete's whereabouts and background, the evidence simply didn't line up. He was ultimately cleared, ruled out as a suspect entirely, which meant investigators were back to the far more unsettling possibility that whoever did this to Sylvia may have been someone with no prior connection to her at all. A stranger. Someone who broke into a stranger's home in the middle of the night with violent intent, for reasons that may have had nothing to do with Sylvia personally. That's an especially difficult kind of case to solve, because there's no obvious motive to trace, no relationship to investigate, no argument or grudge or history to follow backward toward a name. It's the investigative equivalent of trying to find a single person in an entire city with almost nothing to go on. And then, almost as if the case couldn't get any stranger, something happened that pulled the investigation in a completely different and completely bizarre direction. Because buried in that crime scene was one piece of evidence that the killer couldn't take with him. One piece of evidence that science, in 1981, didn't yet have the power to use. But one day, decades later, it would talk. And when it finally did, it would lead investigators somewhere no one expected. To a quiet town in Nebraska. To an ordinary-looking 62-year-old individual, looking harmless and innocent before his neighbors. And to a discarded vanilla Coke can sitting in a dumpster outside an apartment. We'll get there. But first, you need to understand just how close this case came to being closed, with the wrong person. Because in 1983, someone confessed to killing Sylvia Quayle. And for a while, everyone believed him. His name was Otis Elwood Toole. If you know true crime, that name probably just sent a chill down your spine. Because Toole wasn't just any suspect. He was one of the most notorious drifters in American criminal history, a man whose name is still tied to some of the darkest unsolved cases of the 20th century. And in 1983, just 2 years after Sylvia's murder, Toole sat down with investigators and confessed. He described the scene. He talked about the trees around Sylvia's home, the hedges lining the property, details that, on the surface, sounded like they could only come from someone who had actually been there. For a grieving family who had already waited 2 agonizing years for answers, this must have felt like the end of the nightmare. Finally, a name, a face, a reason. But here's where the story takes its first devastating twist. Because Toole wasn't alone in his pattern of confessions. He often ran alongside another man, Henry Lee Lucas, and together, the two of them would go on to confess to hundreds of murders across the country. Hundreds. But as investigators dug deeper into case after case, something troubling emerged. Many of those confessions didn't hold up. Not because Toole and Lucas weren't dangerous men, they absolutely were. But because their confessions became almost performative. Detectives from different states, desperate to close their own cold cases, would feed them details. And Toole and Lucas, for reasons investigators still debate to this day, would simply agree. Confess. Move on to the next unsolved case placed in front of them. Just imagine that for seconds. Of the hundreds of murders they claimed, authorities were only ever able to confirm a small handful. And Sylvia's case? It became one of the ones that didn't hold up. Because in 1993, a full decade after Toole's confession, the district attorney at the time, Bob Gallagher, made the difficult decision to formally drop the charges against him. Why? Because science had finally caught up. DNA testing on the evidence collected from Sylvia's home proved, conclusively, that Toole was not a match. He hadn't done it. Which meant that for over a decade, the case had been sitting in a kind of false resolution. A story everyone believed was finished, until it wasn't, and we are back to where we started. Investigators were back to square one. Worse than square one, actually. Because now they didn't just have an unsolved murder, they had a false lead that had eaten away years of momentum, years of public attention, years the real killer used to disappear even further into an ordinary life. But here's something you need to understand about this case, and about the detectives who refused to let it die. Even in 1983, before DNA testing was even remotely what it is today, someone made a decision that would end up cracking this case open decades later. Forensic technicians, using an alternate light source, discovered something on the orange area rug where Sylvia had died. A trace. Nearly invisible. Almost lost to time. It would later be identified as semen. And in 1995, over a decade after that initial discovery, a section of that same rug was carefully cut out and sent to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation for testing. 5 years later, in 2000, that sample finally produced something concrete, an unknown male DNA profile. Finally, something real. Something scientific. Something that didn't rely on a confession from a man notorious for lying. Investigators immediately plugged that profile into CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database, the same system that has cracked open thousands of cold cases across the country. They waited. And nothing. No match. The profile existed. The evidence was real. But the man behind it wasn't in the system. He hadn't been arrested for a violent crime. He hadn't been swabbed. He hadn't left a single trace of himself in any database that law enforcement had access to. He was, in every sense of the word, a ghost. And here's the part of this story that should genuinely disturb you. While Sylvia's DNA sample sat in a database with no answers, her killer was still out there, living, working, existing in the world as if nothing had ever happened. In fact, and this detail wouldn't come out until years later, investigators would eventually uncover a disturbing pattern connected to this same unknown profile. Between 1981 and 1986, a string of at least 8 home and business burglaries occurred in the same general area. In some of these break-ins, the person wore gloves. In at least one of them, he removed a window screen to gain entry, the exact same method used to get into Sylvia's home. Which means that even after taking Sylvia's life, this man didn't stop. He didn't disappear. He continued moving through neighborhoods, breaking into homes, growing more comfortable, more confident, more invisible. And for nearly 2 decades after that, nothing. No arrest. No match. No name. Just a family, growing older, still waiting. Sylvia's parents, William and Mary Quayle, spent the rest of their lives without answers. They lived, as we mentioned earlier, just 150 feet from where their daughter was murdered. Every single day, they walked past reminders of her. Every single day, they waited for a phone call that never came. William passed away in 1999. Mary followed 10 years later, in 2009. Neither one of them lived to see their daughter's killer identified. Neither one of them got the closure they spent decades hoping for. Let that sink in for a moment. 2 parents. 2 entire lifetimes spent grieving a violent, senseless loss, and neither one of them got to see justice happen. If you're feeling something right now, if there's a tightness in your chest, a lump in your throat, hold on to that. Because this story isn't over. And what happens next will show you exactly how far modern science and modern determination can go to finally answer questions that seemed impossible to solve. Because here's the thing about DNA. It doesn't disappear. It doesn't get old, it doesn't get tired, it doesn't give up. It just waits. Waits for the technology to catch up. Waits for someone determined enough to look again. Waits for its moment. And in 2019, almost 40 years after Sylvia Quayle took her last breath in her own living room, that moment finally started to arrive. Because a new kind of investigative technique was starting to change the entire landscape of cold case work in America. A technique that had already caught one of the most infamous serial killers in modern history. And it was about to be turned loose on Sylvia's case. But this is where things get really interesting. Because to understand how they finally found her killer, you first need to understand the extraordinary lengths one investigator went to, secretly, just to get a single sample of DNA. It started with a stakeout. It ended with a dumpster. And in between, it all came down to a can of vanilla Coke. Let's talk about how cold cases actually get solved in the modern era. Because what happened next in Sylvia Quayle's story wasn't luck. It wasn't a lucky tip or a deathbed confession. It was science, combined with old-fashioned, relentless human determination. In 2018, the world watched as investigators in California cracked open one of the most infamous unsolved serial killer cases in American history, the Golden State Killer. 4 decades, that case sat cold, seemingly unsolvable, the killer's identity a total mystery. Until genetic genealogy changed everything. Here's the basic idea, in simple terms. Instead of just searching a criminal DNA database for an exact match, which only works if the person has been arrested or tested before, investigators started uploading DNA profiles to public genealogy databases. The same kind of databases regular people use to trace their family trees. Suddenly, instead of needing an exact match to the killer himself, investigators only needed a distant relative, a second cousin, a great-aunt, anyone who had ever spit into a tube out of simple curiosity about their own ancestry. From there, genealogists could build out entire family trees, branch by branch, generation by generation, slowly narrowing down the pool of possible suspects until one name remained. It was revolutionary. And it was about to change everything for Sylvia's case, too. In 2019, an organization called Metro Denver Crime Stoppers partnered with a company called United Data Connect, founded, notably, by a former Denver district attorney who had transitioned his career entirely into this emerging field. This wasn't United Data Connect's first success, either. That same team had already helped identify a suspect in another gut-wrenching cold case, the 1963 murder of 16-year-old Margaret Peggy Beck, a Girl Scout counselor who was found lifeless in her tent during a camping trip. Using these same genealogy techniques, they named a suspect in that case too, a man who vanished in 1976 and whose whereabouts, to this day, remain unknown. If they could do that for a case nearly 60 years old, maybe, just maybe, they could do it for Sylvia. In January 2020, Cherry Hills Village cold case detectives, alongside investigators from the district attorney's office, brought Sylvia's case directly to Crime Stoppers. According to their own internal review, they believed the DNA evidence collected decades earlier, that unknown male profile sitting quietly in CODIS since 2000, could finally be used with this new, more powerful technique. It was, in many ways, a last real chance. And 4 months later, it worked. United Data Connect's technicians had built out a family tree extensive enough, detailed enough, to land on a single name. David Dwayne Anderson. Let that name sink in for a moment. Because for almost 40 years, that name meant nothing to anyone investigating Sylvia's murder. He wasn't a person of interest. He wasn't a name in a file. He was simply a stranger. An unknown quantity hidden somewhere in the branches of a family tree that had finally, painstakingly, been pieced together. And here's a detail that will genuinely give you chills. At the time of Sylvia's murder in 1981, David Dwayne Anderson didn't live across the country. He didn't live in another state. He lived a couple of miles away, in the neighboring town of Englewood. He was 22 years old. He was, quite possibly, someone Sylvia might have crossed paths with. Someone who shopped at the same stores, drove the same streets, existed, quietly, in the same small radius of suburban Colorado life, all while carrying a secret that would take 4 decades to surface. But having a name wasn't enough. Genetic genealogy can point investigators in a direction, but it can't make an arrest. For that, they needed something undeniable, something modern, something that would hold up, beyond any doubt, in a court of law. They needed his actual DNA, directly, not a distant relative's, not a family tree estimate, his. And they needed to get it without him ever knowing. This is where the story shifts from courtroom procedure into something that genuinely feels like a movie. Cold case detectives quietly began investigating Anderson's life. Where he lived now. What he did. Who he'd become in the 4 decades since that August night in 1981. They discovered he had settled in Cozad, Nebraska, a small town, the kind of place where nobody would expect a decades-old murder investigation to suddenly arrive at your doorstep. In January, an investigator working with United Data Connect, a man named Robert Fuller, traveled there personally. His mission was simple in concept, but incredibly delicate in execution: obtain a sample of Anderson's DNA without ever alerting him that he was being watched. Because if Anderson found out, even for a moment, he could disappear. Destroy evidence. Run. So Fuller waited. He watched Anderson's apartment complex from the outside. Quietly, patiently, studying his routine, the same way, in a chilling parallel, the killer himself once studied Sylvia's house nearly 40 years earlier. And then, on January 18th, Fuller saw his opportunity. Anderson took out his trash. 2 ordinary trash bags, tossed into an ordinary dumpster, in an ordinary parking lot. Exactly the kind of moment that happens in every apartment complex in America, every single day, without anyone thinking twice about it. Except this time, someone was watching. Once Anderson walked away, Fuller retrieved those bags. Inside, he found 15 separate items that potentially carried Anderson's genetic material, everyday things, the kind of trash any of us throw away without a second thought. 2 days later, Fuller met with an investigator at a travel stop in Sterling, Colorado, to formally hand over what he'd collected. Each item had been carefully placed into its own individual evidence bag. Among those 15 items were a handful that would soon become the most important pieces of evidence in this entire 40-year investigation. A great value water bottle, a spiced rum bottle, a Michelob Ultra beer bottle, and one vanilla Coke can, an ordinary soda can. The kind of thing that ends up in millions of dumpsters across the country every single day, completely forgotten the moment it's thrown away. Except this one wasn't forgotten. This one was about to close a 40-year-old case. Because when the Colorado Bureau of Investigation ran their analysis on that evidence, they didn't just get a DNA profile. They got a match. And when I tell you what that match confirmed, when I walk you through exactly how many pieces of Sylvia's original crime scene evidence lit up in response to this one soda can, you're going to understand exactly why this case, after everything, after every false lead and every decade of silence, finally had its answer. But that reveal deserves its own moment. Because what happened next didn't just identify a suspect. It confirmed, beyond any shadow of a doubt, exactly who had taken Sylvia Quayle's life on that August night in 1981. And it happened because of a can of soda he never thought twice about throwing away. On January 29, 2021, a lab report landed on Detective Lenny Abate's desk. And in that single moment, 4 decades of searching, waiting, and heartbreak were about to collide with the truth. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation had developed a male DNA profile from that vanilla Coke can. And that profile was a direct match to multiple pieces of evidence recovered from Sylvia Quayle's body in her home, all the way back in 1981. Read that again. Not one piece of evidence. Multiple. Let's walk through exactly what that meant, because the scale of this match is what makes it so undeniable. Remember those carpet fibers, taken from the orange area rug where Sylvia had died? The same rug where forensic technicians, all the way back in 1983, first discovered a barely visible trace using an alternate light source? That trace contained Anderson's semen. Remember the autopsy conducted in the immediate aftermath of Sylvia's murder? Swabs taken directly from her body during that examination also matched Anderson's DNA. A swab taken from her left breast. A swab taken during her autopsy. And remember that white towel, the one her killer had thrown over her face, the one her devastated father later used to try to cover his daughter's body out of nothing but love and grief? That towel contained a mixture. Sylvia's blood. And Anderson's semen. Every piece of physical evidence, collected independently, decades apart, using different techniques, at different points in this exhausting 40-year investigation, all of it pointed to the exact same man. There was no more room for doubt. No more room for a false confession to derail the truth. No more room for another decade of searching. They finally had him. Investigators then looked deeper into who David Dwayne Anderson actually was, both in 1981 and in the years that followed. And what they found only reinforced everything the DNA had already told them. Between 1981 and 1986, starting the very same year Sylvia was murdered, Anderson was connected to a string of at least 8 home and business burglaries in the surrounding area. On at least 2 of those occasions, he wore gloves. A small detail, but a telling one, evidence of someone who understood, even back then, the importance of not leaving evidence behind. And in one of those home burglaries specifically, he removed and discarded a window screen in order to gain entry. The exact same method used to break into Sylvia's home on the night she died. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a pattern. A signature. A method this man had developed and repeated, quietly, across years, while an entire community had no idea the person responsible for one of its most brutal unsolved murders was still walking among them, still breaking into homes, still refining the very same technique that had once let him into Sylvia's house undetected. On February 10, 2021, that pattern finally caught up to him. David Dwayne Anderson, now 62 years old, was arrested in Cozad, Nebraska. Not in a dramatic standoff. Not in a high-speed chase. Just quietly, finally, after 40 years of hiding in plain sight as an ordinary man living an ordinary life in a small Nebraska town. He now faces 2 counts of first-degree murder. One charge alleges Sylvia was killed after deliberation, meaning prosecutors believe this was planned, not impulsive. The other accuses him of killing her during the commission of another serious crime. If convicted, Anderson faces life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. That was the law in place back in 1981, and because the crime occurred then, that's the law that applies to his case now. Under Colorado's current laws, first-degree murder no longer allows for parole at all. But because of when this crime happened, the older sentencing rules still govern this case. I'm not sure that makes sense to me, but oh well. Here's a detail I think about a lot when I look at this case as a whole. Anderson wasn't found because he made a mistake in 1981. He wasn't caught because of some flaw in his plan that night. He was found because science eventually outgrew the limitations of its own time. Because one man, decades later, decided to secretly follow another man to a dumpster. Because of a rug fiber preserved since 1983. Because of a discarded soda can he never imagined would ever be traced back to him. For nearly 40 years, David Dwayne Anderson lived his life believing he had gotten away with it. He was wrong. But while the arrest itself brought a sense of long overdue resolution, it also brought something else back to the surface. Something raw, something that had never really healed. Because on the day this arrest was finally announced to the public, Sylvia's family had to sit through a news conference and hear, once again, every painful detail of what happened to her. Except this time, for the first time in nearly 40 years, they finally had a name to attach to that pain. And that brings us to one of the most emotional parts of this entire story. Because after decades of silence, after decades of unanswered questions, Sylvia's family finally got to stand in front of a room, in front of cameras, in front of an entire community, and simply say her name again. Not as a victim. Not as a case number. As a person. And what they shared about who Sylvia really was, the woman behind the headlines, behind the case file, behind the DNA reports, is something that, I promise you, is going to stay with you long after this video ends. On the day this arrest was finally announced, Cherry Hills Village Police Chief Michelle Tovria stood in front of a room full of reporters, cameras, and community members. But before she talked about DNA, before she talked about evidence or arrests or charges, she did something far more important. She talked about who Sylvia actually was. Because somewhere along the way, in every cold case, in every headline, in every retelling of a tragedy, the victim risks becoming just a name attached to a horror. A statistic. A case file number sitting in an evidence room for 40 years. Chief Tovria refused to let that happen to Sylvia. She told the room that Sylvia's sister and family had chosen to have a very specific phrase etched onto her grave marker. Beauty seen is never lost. Sit with that for a second. Because after everything this family went through, after the horror of that morning, after the false confession, after the decades of silence, after watching both of Sylvia's parents die without ever getting answers, the words her own family chose to define her weren't about how she died. They were about how she lived. Chief Tovria described her as ambitious, vibrant, friendly, the kind of person who lit up an entire room just by walking into it. She talked about Sylvia's pottery, handmade pieces that, more than 3 decades after her death, still sit in her sister's home. Not as evidence. Not as memorabilia. As pieces of a life, a talent, a person who is still, in some small way, present in the people who loved her. She talked about the wedding cake business Sylvia had built entirely on her own, a small entrepreneurial dream she was actively pursuing at just 34 years old, cut short before she ever got to see how far it might have gone. She talked about Sylvia's fascination with history and how she spent hours researching the architectural work of her own uncle, tracing his legacy, connecting herself to a family story that stretched back generations. And then, Chief Tovria shared something that made the entire room go quiet. She said that Sylvia had a lot of friends, the kind of friends she would have given her very last dollar to, if they needed it more than she did. That's not just a nice detail. That's a defining trait. That's the kind of thing people say about someone when they mean it, when it's not just a polite thing to say at a memorial, but a genuine truth about who someone was when nobody was watching. And then came the detail that broke hearts across that entire room. Sylvia had coffee with her parents every single morning. Not because she had to. Because she wanted to. Because her relationship with William and Mary Quayle wasn't complicated, wasn't strained, wasn't something she tolerated out of obligation. It was close. Loving. Real. Sylvia had a wonderful, loving relationship with her parents, Chief Tovria said. They missed her deeply. And that single sentence carries the weight of an entire, unbearable reality. William and Mary Quayle spent the remaining years of their lives just 150 feet from where their daughter died. Every single morning, for the rest of their lives, they woke up in a world where that coffee never got poured again. Where that walk between houses only happened in memory. Where a name, once spoken every day with warmth and love, became something they could only whisper through grief. William passed away in 1999. Mary followed 10 years later, in 2009. Neither one of them ever learned the name David Dwayne Anderson. Neither one of them ever got to sit in a courtroom and watch justice unfold. Neither one of them ever got closure. That's the part of this story that true crime content often skips past too quickly. We focus on the twist, the DNA breakthrough, the dramatic reveal, and sometimes we forget the simplest, most devastating truth sitting underneath all of it. An entire family lived out the rest of their lives in the shadow of a question that never got answered in time. But Sylvia's sister and brother-in-law did get to see this moment. They sat in that room, decades later, and finally heard a name spoken alongside the word arrested. And representing the very technology that made this moment possible was Mitch Morrissey, the former prosecutor who founded United Data Connect, the same organization whose genealogy work finally cracked this case wide open. Morrissey said something that day that I think captures the emotional weight of this entire case better than almost anything else. He said it meant a great deal to him personally to finally meet Sylvia's remaining family. But there was one detail of the case that stayed with him more than any other: the fact that it was Sylvia's own father who discovered her body that morning. The way that she was left after being brutalized and murdered, Morrissey said, "I can't imagine, as a father myself, of a young woman about this age, to have a morning like that." Let that settle for a moment. Because this case isn't just about forensic science. It isn't just about genetic genealogy, or DNA databases, or a discarded soda can in a Nebraska dumpster. At its absolute core, this is a story about a father who walked 150 feet expecting to see his daughter smile, and instead found something no parent should ever have to witness. It's about two parents who spent the rest of their lives waiting for a phone call that came 10 years too late for one of them, and 20 years too late for the other. It's about a sister who kept her siblings' handmade pottery in her home for over 30 years, refusing to let that connection fade. And it's about a community, a police department, that never stopped working this case, even when every lead went cold, even when the wrong man was almost convicted, even when 40 years passed without answers. Chief Tovria said something at that news conference that I think is the perfect way to understand just how long this case had weighed on the people trying to solve it. She said she was proud to tell Sylvia's sister and brother-in-law that the men and women of her department had been waiting almost 40 years for the chance to make this exact announcement. 40 years. Read that again. 40 years of detectives coming and going. 40 years of case files sitting in storage. 40 years of a single DNA profile waiting patiently in a database for the technology to finally catch up. And it all came down to one moment. One decision. One dumpster. One can of vanilla Coke that a man in Cozad, Nebraska never imagined would ever be traced back to a night in August 1981. This is where things started going wrong for David Dwayne Anderson. Not in 1981. Not when he thought he'd gotten away with it. But decades later, when science, patience, and one determined investigator finally caught up to a mistake he never even realized he'd made. So where does that leave us? For nearly 40 years, David Dwayne Anderson lived his life as an ordinary man. He worked. He lived in a quiet Nebraska town. He probably had neighbors who had no idea who he really was, or what he had allegedly done on one brutal night in August of 1981. He built an entire life on the assumption that the past was buried, that the evidence collected all those decades ago would never catch up to him, that a rug fiber, an autopsy swab, and a blooded towel would remain exactly what they had been for 40 years, unanswered questions in a cold case file gathering dust. But evidence doesn't expire. And in this case, it simply waited for the world to catch up to it. It waited through a false confession that nearly closed this case with the wrong man behind bars. It waited through an agonizing decade before DNA testing even cleared that false suspect. It waited through the creation of CODIS and the disappointment of a search that came back empty. It waited through the deaths of two parents who never got to see justice done. And it waited, finally, for a technique nobody could have imagined back in 1981, genetic genealogy, to trace an unknown profile through a family tree, all the way down to a single name. And then, it waited just a little longer. For one investigator, watching quietly from outside an apartment complex in Nebraska. For one ordinary moment, a man taking out his trash, to become the moment that ended 4 decades of silence. A vanilla Coke can. That's what it came down to. Not a confession. Not a breakdown. Not a moment of guilt catching up with him. Just an ordinary piece of trash, thrown away without a second thought, that carried inside it the one thing that could never lie, his own DNA. And when that DNA lit up against evidence collected from Sylvia Quayle's body, her rug, and the towel that once covered her face, there was no more room for doubt. No more room for another decade of waiting. No more room for anything except the truth. David Dwayne Anderson now faces 2 counts of first-degree murder. If convicted, he faces life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20 years, the sentencing law that existed back in 1981 when Sylvia lost her life. But no sentence, no matter how long, can ever give back what was actually taken that night. It can't give Sylvia back the decade she should have had. The wedding cake she never got to finish designing. The pottery she never got to create. The mornings of coffee with her parents that should have continued for years, not stopped abruptly on one August night. It can't give William and Mary Quayle the 10 and 20 extra years they spent not knowing. It can't give them the chance to sit in a courtroom and see their daughter's killer finally held accountable. But it can give something to the people still here. It can give Sylvia's sister the chance to finally say her sister's name in front of a room full of people, and know that this time, it isn't attached to a question mark. It's attached to an answer. It can give an entire police department, one that worked this case for almost 40 years without ever fully letting it go, the chance to look a grieving family in the eye and say, "We didn't forget her." And it can give the rest of us something, too. A reminder that no matter how much time passes, no matter how cold a case becomes, no matter how many false leads or dead ends stand in the way, the truth doesn't disappear. It waits. Quietly. Patiently. Sometimes for decades. Sometimes inside a single strand of DNA sitting in an evidence locker, untouched, until the exact right moment arrives. Sylvia Quayle was 34 years old when her life was taken from her in the home she loved, just steps away from the parents she adored. But almost 40 years later, because of one persistent detective, one determined genealogy team, and one overlooked can of soda in a Nebraska dumpster, the world finally knows the truth. And on her grave marker, in the words her own family chose to define her legacy, is a sentence that feels more true today than ever before. Beauty seen is never lost. Sylvia may have been taken from this world far too soon. But through the people who loved her, through the pottery still sitting in her sister's home, and through a case that refused to stay buried, she was never truly lost at all. Sylvia Quayle's case leaves behind more than just a resolved file. It leaves a set of hard, real lessons about patience, science, and what it actually takes to bring a family an answer after 41 years. Let's break down 5 lessons we can take away from what happened to Sylvia. When investigators found foreign biological material on a small area rug in 1983, they had discovered something genuinely important, and they had almost no way to use it. DNA testing as an investigative tool essentially didn't exist yet. There was no database to compare it against, no technology capable of translating that sample into a name. All they could do was preserve it and wait. And wait they did. 12 years passed before that rug was even sent for testing in 1995. 5 more years passed after that before a full DNA profile could finally be developed, in the year 2000. That's 19 years between the moment investigators first suspected they were holding a critical piece of evidence, and the moment they actually had something concrete to work with, and even then, that profile still needed another 20 years, and an entirely different technology, before it could finally be connected to a real person. This lesson is about a specific kind of patience that almost no other field demands in quite the same way. The discipline of preserving something valuable long before you have any way to use it, purely on faith that the tools to unlock it will eventually exist. Every investigator who handled that rug across 4 decades, from the officer who first tested it in 1983, to the lab technician who processed it in 1995, to the analyst who finally built a full profile in 2000, was doing work whose payoff they might never live to see. Most of them probably didn't. And that's exactly what makes this lesson so powerful. Real progress on the hardest problems often isn't a single breakthrough moment. It's decades of unglamorous, faithful maintenance, performed by people who understood that someone, someday, might need what they were preserving. When Otis Toole and Henry Lee Lucas came forward claiming responsibility for Sylvia's death, it must have felt, for a moment, like the case was finally cracking open. These were real, dangerous men, already convicted of serious crimes, offering details that initially seemed to line up with what investigators knew. For a family desperate for an answer, even a false hope like that can feel almost unbearable to sit with. But investigators didn't take the confession at face value. They tested it, literally, scientifically, against the DNA evidence they had preserved. And when it didn't match, they had the discipline to rule both men out completely, rather than letting a convenient, headline-grabbing confession quietly become the accepted version of events. This lesson matters enormously, because history is full of cases where the opposite happened, where a confident, detailed-sounding confession from the wrong person was accepted without enough scrutiny, and an innocent person paid the price while the actual perpetrator walked free. Toole and Lucas were, by their own later admission, chasing attention, not confessing truth. The fact that Cherry Hills Village investigators insisted on physical proof before accepting their story is a quiet but crucial example of exactly the kind of rigor that separates a case that eventually gets solved correctly from one that gets closed on the wrong name entirely. A confession, however convincing, is a claim, not a conclusion. Sylvia's father was the one who found her that August morning in 1981. He carried that image and that unanswered question for the rest of his life, and he died without ever learning who was responsible for what happened to his daughter. 41 years of waiting, and the case wasn't resolved until after he was already gone. This is one of the most quietly devastating truths in cold case investigations, and it's rarely talked about with the weight it deserves. Solving a case eventually is a genuine victory, for the surviving family, for the investigators who refused to give up, for the broader pursuit of justice. But eventually is not the same as in time. For every case that finally gets solved after decades, there are family members, parents, siblings, spouses, who don't live long enough to see it happen. Sylvia's sister, Jo, got to stand in that courtroom in 2022 and hear a guilty verdict. Their father never did. This lesson isn't a reason to stop pursuing cold cases, quite the opposite. It's a reason to pursue them with even greater urgency, because every year a case remains unsolved is a year some family member may run out of time to see it resolved. It's also a reason for anyone supporting a family through an unsolved loss to hold both truths simultaneously. Hope for resolution is legitimate and worth fighting for, and grief for those who won't be there to witness it is just as real and deserves to be acknowledged, not brushed aside in favor of an eventual happy ending. When investigators finally uploaded Sylvia's crime scene DNA profile to public genealogy databases in 2020, they weren't met with a single, clean match to a known suspect. They were met with an enormous, sprawling family tree containing over 3,300 people, a number that, on its face, looks less like a breakthrough and more like an impossible haystack. But that's precisely how modern investigative genetic genealogy works, and it's worth understanding why. Instead of searching for an exact match to a known criminal in a law enforcement database, the way DNA testing worked for decades, this technique searches for any genetic relative, however distant, in massive consumer databases full of ordinary people who submitted their DNA purely out of curiosity about their own ancestry. That search almost never returns a single suspect immediately. It returns a web of relatives, and it's the painstaking work of tracing that web, cross-referencing it against marriage records, obituaries, newspaper archives, and public documents, that eventually narrows thousands of names down to one. This lesson reframes what progress looks like in a complex investigation. Getting a result that initially looks overwhelming, 3,300 names instead of 0, isn't a setback. It's actually the exact moment a case shifts from unsolvable to solvable, because now there's real information to work with, even if it takes months of meticulous background research to turn that information into a name. The team that cracked Sylvia's case didn't get discouraged by the size of that tree. They treated it as the beginning of the answer, not an obstacle in front of one. When David Anderson was finally sentenced in August of 2022, a prosecutor working the case said something that captured the rawest injustice sitting underneath every legal detail. That after taking Sylvia's life, Anderson went on to live a completely normal existence. He got married. He raised children. He experienced 4 decades of an ordinary life that Sylvia never got the chance to have. That's not something a guilty verdict or a life sentence can actually repair. The legal system can hold someone accountable, and it did, eventually, in this case. It can impose consequences, limit freedom, deliver a measure of justice. But it cannot give back the 41 years Sylvia didn't get to live, the family she might have started, the life she might have built. No sentence, however severe, closes that particular gap. This lesson matters because it resists the temptation to treat a guilty verdict as a tidy, satisfying ending, the moment where everything gets made right. Real cases, even ones that end in genuine accountability, still leave behind permanent, unrecoverable loss. Naming that loss honestly, the way this prosecutor did in open court, isn't pessimism. It's respect for Sylvia, for her family, and for the difference between punishing a crime and truly undoing its damage. Justice, in cases like this, is the best available response to something that can never actually be fixed. Understanding that distinction is part of what it means to take a story like Sylvia's seriously, instead of wrapping it in a bow it was never going to fit. If this story moved you the way it moved me while researching it, hit the like button. It helps get her story, and the 41 years her family waited, in front of more people who need to hear it. Drop a comment. Do you think justice was really served here, or is there no version of justice that could ever be enough after 41 years? And if these cases hit you the way they hit me, subscribe now, because there's another story waiting to be told that's just as heartbreaking. Because here's the thing about Sylvia's case, the man responsible was a stranger. Someone she never knew, who broke into her life without warning, and then simply walked away and built a normal one of his own. In another case, on the other side of the country, her family didn't have that same kind of distance to hold on to. Because when the DNA finally came back, it didn't point to a stranger at all. A 16-year-old girl. A summer job. A quiet bedroom, one floor above a family that was sound asleep and had absolutely no idea anything was wrong. If you think waiting 41 years for a stranger's name is hard to sit with, wait until you hear what it took for this next family to learn the truth was never a stranger at all. Click the video on your screen right now, and let's go back to Kansas City, 1989. I'll see you there.